Summer of 1943, rural Texas, United States. After the Italian surrender and the battles in North Africa, thousands of Italian soldiers were transferred to prisoner of war camps on American soil. The Geneva Convention mandated humane treatment of prisoners, but reality often diverged from those international norms. The cattle cars stopped under the relentless Texas sun. 300 men in faded uniforms stepped down with their eyes lowered, carrying only the shame of defeat and the fear of what was to come. Italian soldiers, prisoners of war, were setting foot on American soil for the first time. They had heard terrible stories about concentration camps, forced labor, and systematic humiliation. The July heat scorched their necks as they marched toward the barbed wire gates. This is the story of the Italian prisoners who expected hunger and revenge until they discovered America's strange hospitality, an account that challenges everything they thought they knew about war and humanity. The first sign that something was different came when an American guard offered them fresh water. Steel rails cut across the vast Texas landscape like metallic scars beneath the pitiless July sky. The freight train slowed with a long screech of brakes, announcing the end of a journey that had begun on the dusty battlefields of Tunisia. 300 Italian soldiers, packed into cattle cars for 5 consecutive days, felt their hearts quicken as the doors slid open with a metallic crash. The blinding American desert light flooded the cramped space, revealing gaunt faces, overgrown beards, and eyes heavy with the weight of defeat. Some murmured prayers in southern Italian dialects. Others remained in sepulchral silence, steeling themselves for the worst. The acrid smell of sweat mixed with the stench of dirty straw saturated the stifling air. In that moment, each man knew his life as a soldier was over, but none could imagine what kind of prisoner he would become. Sergeant Giuseppe Torriani was the first to step down, his military boots touching American soil with hesitation. 32 years old and a veteran of the Libyan and Tunisian campaigns, he wore medals on his chest that now seemed to mock his condition as a prisoner. His brown eyes quickly scanned the scene. A small railway station, a few wooden sheds in the distance, and a line of armed American soldiers waiting with neutral expressions. The heat was unlike the African desert, drier and more penetrating, sending sweat running instantly down his temples. Torriani had commanded an entire company until the final surrender, when ammunition ran out and resistance became useless. Now he watched his men climbing down from the cars like ghosts of their former selves, carrying only improvised bundles of personal belongings. The humiliation of capture still burned in his chest like a branding iron. He expected shouting, whippings, perhaps even summary executions, but found only a tense professional silence. Private Marco Benedetti, barely 18, trembled not only from the heat but from the terror that gripped his gut. Born in a small village near Naples, he had been drafted only 8 months earlier, hardly having time to say goodbye to his mother and fiancé. His nervous fingers clutched a worn photograph he kept in his shirt pocket, the only link to the life he had left behind. The stories circulating among the soldiers about prisoner camps were terrifying. Forced labor to the point of death, medical experiments, executions for sport. Marco watched the American guards with wide eyes, trying to read their intentions through impassive expressions. The crisp American uniforms seemed immaculate compared to the rags he wore, heightening his sense of inferiority and vulnerability. Every movement of the guards felt like a potential threat, every glance like a promise of imminent violence. His hand shook uncontrollably as he fell into line with the other prisoners. Corporal Salvatore Russo, a 40-year-old man with battle scars etched across his face, held himself upright despite the extreme fatigue. A veteran of the Ethiopian War and later the African campaign, he had developed a keen instinct for danger. His seasoned eyes analyzed every detail of the surroundings, the positioning of the guards, the weapons they carried, the possible escape routes. Russo had survived bombings, ambushes, and hand-to-hand combat, always relying on his ability to read the enemy's intentions. Yet something about this scene left him both puzzled and on edge. The American soldiers showed none of the typical aggression of men who had just captured their enemies. There were no insults, no spit in the face, no unnecessary blows. This apparent calm unsettled him more than any overt act of hostility, for it suggested a more refined, calculated cruelty. Russo braced himself mentally to withstand torture and brutal interrogations, determined not to reveal military information even under the worst circumstances. The prisoners were assembled in a surprisingly orderly fashion, without the shoving and shouting they had anticipated. A mid-ranking American officer approached with a clipboard in hand, speaking English with an accent none of the Italians fully understood. His words sounded formal, almost bureaucratic, as if he were processing a shipment of goods rather than captured enemy soldiers. An interpreter, a young American soldier of Italian descent, translated the basic instructions: form a line, remain silent, follow orders without question. There were no explicit threats of death or torture, only administrative procedures that felt strangely civilized. The prisoners exchanged confused glances, trying to decide whether this formal courtesy was genuine or merely the prelude to more elaborate horrors. The Texas sun remained merciless, turning their uniforms into personal furnaces, but no one offered shade or water. That apparent indifference to their physical suffering felt more familiar and, in a way, more reassuring than the disconcerting politeness of the process. As they waited for further instructions, Giuseppe Torriani carefully observed the movements around the railway station. American military trucks stood parked in formation, ready to transport them to their final destination. The vehicles looked well-maintained, with no traces of blood or evidence of mistreated prisoners. This observation sparked a brief flicker of hope in his chest, quickly smothered by the cynicism of a man who had seen too much of human nature in wartime. Perhaps the Americans were simply more efficient at hiding their cruelty, or perhaps they followed different protocols than he had imagined. In any case, he knew the next moments would set the tone for his captivity, and possibly his chances of survival. The hot Texas wind carried strange scents, a mix of dry earth, machine oil, and something faintly reminiscent of freshly baked bread. That last detail disturbed him deeply, for he could not imagine his captors caring enough to provide decent meals for prisoners of war. The first day on American soil would soon draw to a close, but their memories were already being rewritten by the unsettling reality of that initial encounter. The convoy of military trucks rumbled down the dirt road, kicking up clouds of reddish dust that clung to the sweat-soaked skin of the Italian prisoners. Giuseppe Torriani, seated on the metal bed of one of the vehicles, watched the Texas landscape through the side rails, trying to memorize every detail that might prove useful in an eventual escape. The horizon stretched endlessly beneath a steel blue sky, dotted here and there with cacti and dried shrubs that seemed to mock any attempt at survival in such a hostile environment. The other prisoners swayed silently with the jolts of the truck, each lost in his own fears and speculations about the fate that awaited them. The metallic heat of the truck bed burned through their tattered uniforms, but no one complained, afraid that any sign of discomfort might be interpreted as insubordination. Marco Benedetti kept his eyes fixed on his trembling hands, whispering the prayers his grandmother had taught him, while Salvatore Russo discreetly studied the movements of the American guards. The roar of the engines and the crunch of the wheels on gravel created a monotonous soundtrack that only heightened the tension. After 2 hours of travel, the first structures of the prison camp appeared on the horizon like a disturbing mirage. Barbed wire fences caught the sunlight in blinding flashes, outlining a perimeter that seemed to stretch across several square kilometers. Watchtowers rose at regular intervals, topped with armed guards whose dark silhouettes stood out against the clear sky. Yet something about the layout of the buildings defied the prisoners' expectations of a concentration camp. The barracks seemed arranged with a kind of urban logic, separated by well-defined gravel paths, and surrounded by small gardens which, though dried by the climate, suggested care and planning. An American flag fluttered proudly from the central mast, but next to it, to everyone's surprise, a white flag with a red cross, international symbol of humanitarian protection, waved in the breeze. Giuseppe Torriani frowned, puzzled by this apparent display of respect for international conventions. His military experience told him that few armies bothered with such formalities when dealing with captured enemies. The main gates of the camp opened with a metallic creak that echoed like a long lament. A high-ranking American officer waited at the entrance, flanked by soldiers who maintained a formal, but not threatening posture. Their weapons remained holstered, and their expressions conveyed more professional boredom than overt hostility. The intake process followed procedures that felt more administrative than punitive: verification of identity, cataloging of personal belongings, distribution of prisoner numbers. Each Italian received a small metal tag engraved with his number, but the procedure was carried out with a bureaucratic efficiency that resembled a factory more than a military prison. Marco Benedetti watched in surprise as his personal belongings, including the photograph of his fiancée, were carefully labeled and stored in individual bags with the promise of return after processing. This attention to personal effects contrasted sharply with the stories of confiscation and systematic destruction of mementos they had heard from other prisoners. The aroma of cooking food drifted from somewhere inside the camp, mixing with the scent of disinfectant and fresh wood. The first glimpse of the barracks left the prisoners even more perplexed. Though simple, the buildings looked clean and well ventilated, with windows that allowed natural light and airflow. Wooden bunks were arranged in orderly rows, each equipped with a mattress, pillow, and American military blanket. Small personal lockers offered space to store belongings, and communal wash basins occupied one end of each barrack. Salvatore Russo, accustomed to the harsh conditions of the African trenches, could not hide his astonishment at such relatively comfortable accommodations. There were even small details that suggested concern for the prisoners' well-being: screens on the windows to keep out insects, ceiling fans to soften the heat, and posters in Italian explaining basic rules of conduct. These posters, carefully translated, showed a level of preparation and consideration that completely defied their expectations of how captured enemies would be treated. The rough texture of the military blankets was familiar, but their cleanliness and the smell of soap revealed strict hygiene standards. During the distribution of the bunks, an apparently minor incident caught Giuseppe Torriani's attention. An Italian prisoner, visibly ill and weak, stumbled as he tried to reach his bed. Instantly, an American guard approached, but instead of reprimanding or ignoring him, he offered physical support and called for a military doctor. The prisoner was examined quickly and taken to an infirmary which, according to the interpreter, operated under American medical standards and followed the guidelines of the International Red Cross. Torriani watched this incident with growing confusion, as it directly contradicted everything he knew about the treatment of prisoners of war. In his military experience, captured enemy soldiers were treated as disposable resources, useful only for forced labor or strategic information. The display of genuine medical concern for a sick prisoner seemed almost absurd in its straightforward humanity. He wondered whether it was merely an elaborate show to lower their guard, or if there truly were soldiers capable of treating enemies with basic dignity. As they arranged their few belongings in the individual lockers, the prisoners began to exchange impressions in cautious whispers. Their conversations revealed a mixture of tentative relief and deep mistrust, as none of them could reconcile the treatment they were receiving with their expectations of military captivity. Marco Benedetti confessed to Giuseppe Torriani that he had expected to be beaten upon arrival, based on accounts he had heard from German soldiers captured by the Russians. Salvatore Russo, for his part, admitted that the absence of systematic humiliation made him even more nervous, for it suggested more sophisticated methods of psychological control. All agreed that the Americans seemed to be following some kind of manual that valued efficiency and order over gratuitous brutality. Yet the fundamental question remained: what was the true purpose of this seemingly civilized treatment? The sound of a siren echoed through the camp, signaling dinner time, and the aroma of cooked pasta grew stronger, making their empty stomachs rumble in unison. This promise of a proper meal represented yet another enigma in the growing collection of contradictions that defined their new reality. That first night in the Texas camp would be long and filled with unsettling reflections on the unpredictable nature of humanity in times of war. The Texas dawn painted the sky in shades of orange, as the Italian prisoners awoke to the sound of a gentle siren, far different from the harsh alarms they had imagined. Giuseppe Torriani opened his eyes slowly, momentarily disoriented by the relative comfort of the American mattress compared to nights spent sleeping on the rocky ground of the African desert. Around him, His fellow captives began to move with the caution of men still unsure which behaviors might trigger severe punishment. The aroma of genuine coffee drifted through the morning air, mingling with the smell of frying bacon and fresh bread, creating a home-like atmosphere that clashed sharply with the setting of a military prison. Marco Benedetti remained lying down, watching through the window, as American guards walked the outer corridors, without the aggressive urgency typical of jailers, instead displaying the calm routine of employees keeping regular hours. The texture of the American military blanket was surprisingly soft against his skin, an apparently trivial detail that added to the growing sense of unreality that had enveloped them since their arrival. The camp's mess hall revealed yet another puzzle in the series of contradictions defying their expectations of military prisons. Wooden tables arranged in rows accommodated groups of 8 prisoners each, equipped with fixed but comfortable benches and metal utensils that, though simple, were clean and well-maintained. Meals were served on individual plates by prisoners assigned to kitchen duty, supervised by American military cooks, who showed genuine concern for the quality and quantity of the food. Salvatore Russo, a veteran of wartime rations and periods of extreme hunger, could hardly believe the generosity of the portions. Pasta prepared with real tomato sauce, meat in substantial amounts, fresh vegetables, and bread still steaming from the oven. The American coffee, though different from Italian espresso, was strong and hot, warming not only the body but also awakening nostalgic memories of mornings back home. Conversations in Italian began to flow among the prisoners, at first whispered and cautious, but gradually more animated as they realized they were not reprimanded for speaking their native language. On the 3rd day of captivity, an extraordinary incident completely transformed the prisoners' perception of their American captors. After dinner, as the sun set over the Texas horizon, musical sounds began to emerge from a nearby guard barrack. An American military band was rehearsing a varied repertoire, alternating between patriotic marches and popular songs, when something unexpected occurred that would leave an indelible memory on all the prisoners present. The musicians began to play O Sole Mio, the classic Neapolitan song, with arrangements carefully adapted for military brass and percussion. The familiar melody floated through the desert night air, reaching the incredulous ears of the Italians, who gradually approached the inner fences to listen more closely. Marco Benedetti felt tears well up, involuntarily as the music stirred powerful memories of his homeland, of the serenades he had heard in the squares of Naples and the songs his mother would hum while preparing dinner. The musical precision revealed that the Americans had studied and practiced the piece specifically, suggesting a deliberate intent to perform Italian music for the prisoners. The musical performance continued with other traditional Italian songs, Funiculi Funicula, Santa Lucia, and Torna a Sorrento, each delivered with impressive technical skill and evident respect for the cultural tradition they represented. Giuseppe Torriani, a man hardened by years of combat, found himself emotionally vulnerable before these melodies that linked his uncertain present to cherished memories of a past that seemed lost forever. Other prisoners began to hum softly. Some cried openly. Others smiled for the first time since their capture. Italian music performed by American musicians created an emotional bridge between supposedly enemy cultures, demonstrating that certain artistic expressions transcend national borders and political conflicts. When the band concluded the Italian repertoire with an instrumental version of the Italian national anthem, played with respectful solemnity, many prisoners instinctively stood at attention out of patriotic reflex, creating a moment of recovered dignity amid captivity. The silence that followed was heavy with complex, contradictory emotions, as the Italians found themselves recognized as human beings with their own cultural identity by those who were supposed to be their implacable enemies. In the days that followed, music became a regular feature of camp life, with developments even more surprising that continued to challenge the prisoners' notions of war and humanity. Some American guards began inviting Italian prisoners with musical talent to join the rehearsal sessions, creating mixed groups that combined American military instruments with trained Italian voices. Marco Benedetti, who had sung in his church choir in Naples, was invited to participate in these impromptu musical gatherings, discovering that he could communicate with the American musicians through the universal language of harmony and rhythm. Language barriers dissolved when they made music together, for musical notes have no nationality, and melodies touch hearts regardless of uniforms or flags. Giuseppe Torriani watched these interactions with growing fascination, for they represented something his military experience had never considered possible: enemies discovering shared humanity through art. The sound of genuine laughter began to echo through the camp during these musical sessions, creating an atmosphere more reminiscent of a cultural festival than a military prison. Salvatore Russo, initially skeptical of American intentions, admitted to himself that the experience was rewriting his fundamental understanding of the nature of human conflict. Music had planted seeds of transformation that would continue to grow in the hearts and minds of the prisoners, preparing the ground for even deeper revelations about humanity's ability to transcend hatreds imposed by the tides of history. The first weeks in the Texas camp established a routine that constantly challenged the Italian prisoners' expectations about forced labor and systematic exploitation. Giuseppe Torriani was assigned to supervise a group of 20 men maintaining the camp gardens, a responsibility he initially interpreted as a disguised punishment or a test of submission. He quickly discovered, however, that the agricultural work followed rigorous professional standards, with quality tools, humane schedules, and clearly productive goals rather than punitive ones. The American guards in charge of supervision showed genuine technical knowledge of agriculture and treated the prisoners as temporary collaborators rather than defeated slaves. The gardens produced fresh vegetables that supplemented meals for the entire camp, creating a productive cycle that benefited both captors and prisoners. Marco Benedetti worked in the carpentry shop, repairing and building furniture for the barracks, discovering that his craft skills were valued and respected by the American supervisors. The feel of the worked wood under his hands stirred nostalgic memories of his father's small workshop in Naples, connecting his uncertain present to family traditions he thought he had lost forever. The pay system for the work performed was yet another disconcerting surprise, reinforcing the impression that the Americans were following protocols incomprehensible to men accustomed to conventional military brutality. Each prisoner received a modest amount of U.S. currency for services rendered, enough to buy small luxuries like cigarettes, sweets, or personal hygiene items at the camp's internal store. Salvatore Russo, assigned to electrical maintenance because of his prior technical experience, found he could send part of his earnings to his family in Italy through the International Red Cross, a privilege he had never imagined possible in military captivity. The money represented more than purchasing power. It symbolized recognition of human dignity and the right to personal autonomy, concepts that felt revolutionary in the context of a prisoner of war camp. Transactions at the camp store were conducted with formal politeness, without unnecessary humiliation or arbitrary displays of power. The prisoners began referring to the work as temporary employment, rather than forced labor, a subtle shift in language that reflected deeper transformations in how they perceived their situation. The noise of machines and tools created an industrial soundtrack that evoked peaceful factories rather than slave labor camps. A particularly impactful discovery came when Giuseppe Torriani was invited to a meeting with American camp administrators to discuss improvements to agricultural working conditions. The meeting took place in a room equipped with a conference table, comfortable chairs, and coffee served in porcelain cups, an environment that felt more like a business discussion than a session between captors and prisoners. The Americans listened to his suggestions with respectful attention, took detailed notes, and implemented several of his technical recommendations on crop rotation and more efficient irrigation. Torriani left the meeting deeply unsettled, not by the hostility he had expected, but by the professional seriousness with which his opinions were considered by men who theoretically should have treated him as a defeated enemy. His words carried real weight and influence over administrative decisions, an empowering experience that clashed starkly with his official status as a prisoner of war. Marco Benedetti had a similar experience when he suggested design changes for new benches in the mess hall, discovering that his artisanal expertise was genuinely valued by the American supervisors. The scent of fresh varnish and sawdust clung to his work clothes, familiar smells that awakened a professional pride, dormant since peacetime in Italy. Social interactions during work periods revealed even more intriguing aspects of the American mindset that governed the camp. Young guards often asked curious questions about life in Italy, showing genuine interest in the prisoners' culture, cuisine, and traditions. These informal conversations took place during rest breaks or meals, creating moments of mutual humanization that transcended the divisions imposed by war. Salvatore Russo discovered that many American soldiers had Italian ancestry and spoke fragments of the language learned from immigrant grandparents, creating unexpected personal connections that complicated simple us versus them definitions. A young guard from Chicago revealed that his family kept traditional Neapolitan recipes and asked for advice on how to prepare authentic ragu, bolognese, turning a hierarchical military relationship into a spontaneous cultural exchange. The prisoners began to realize that many of their American captors saw the war as an unfortunate, temporary circumstance that should not completely destroy basic human civility. The sound of shared laughter during these conversations created an atmosphere that fundamentally challenged the ethnic hatred narratives that had fueled the global conflict. During the 4th month of captivity, an event that seemed routine crystallized the profound transformations taking place in the minds of the Italian prisoners. The American camp administration organized a craft fair where prisoners could display and sell items created during their free time, with part of the proceeds going to a fund for families of wounded soldiers on both sides of the conflict. Giuseppe Torriani contributed exceptional vegetables grown in the gardens, Marco Benedetti presented hand-carved miniature furniture, and Salvatore Russo exhibited ingenious electrical devices built from recycled materials. The fair drew local American civilians, including families with children who viewed the handcrafted work with genuine admiration and asked respectful questions about the techniques used. American women purchased pieces from the prisoners as if they were customers in an ordinary shop, treating them with the courtesy reserved for skilled artisans rather than defeated enemies. American children ran between the improvised stalls, laughing and playing without showing fear or hostility, suggesting their families had not taught them to hate Italians as an ethnic group. The event turned into a spontaneous, multicultural celebration, with music, food, and lively conversation that transcended the political circumstances that had brought those people together. Aromas of different cuisines mingled in the air: improvised Italian pizza, Texas barbecue, and traditional American desserts, creating a sensory fusion that symbolized the possibilities of peaceful coexistence. The fair's unexpected success sowed even deeper questions about the nature of war and the national divisions that had defined their lives up to that point. Watching American children play with wooden toys he had carved, Giuseppe Torriani began to question the narratives of racial superiority and inevitable conflict that had justified Italy's involvement in the World War. Marco Benedetti found himself speaking a blend of Italian and basic English with an American woman of Sicilian descent, forming family connections that showed how artificial political borders separated people with shared cultural heritage. Salvatore Russo sold his electrical inventions to local farmers, who would use them for practical applications, proving that his ingenuity had universal value, independent of flags or ideologies. These Italian prisoners were discovering that their American captors were not dehumanized monsters, but complex individuals capable of separating people from policy, humanity from temporary hostilities. The texture of American bills earned honestly through respected work represented something deeper than a commercial transaction. It was recognition of human worth that transcended military circumstances. The sound of sincere applause echoed through the camp when organizers announced that the fair had raised enough funds to help dozens of families in need, creating a moment of shared pride that temporarily united former enemies in a common humanitarian purpose. That night, as they counted their modest but symbolically powerful earnings, the prisoners gathered in the barracks for discussions that would fundamentally redefine their understanding of war, nationality, and human nature. The camp's postal system revealed yet another dimension of American hospitality that continued to bewilder the Italian prisoners with its genuine humanitarian efficiency. 3 weeks after his arrival, Giuseppe Torriani had written his first letter home, expecting it to be harshly censored or simply destroyed as a form of psychological cruelty. To his surprise, the correspondence was processed quickly by American censors, who removed only specific references to the camp's geographic location, leaving intact every personal expression of love, longing, and hope directed to his wife Maria and their 2 young children. The letter from Italy returned in surprisingly short time, carrying words of relief and tears of joy that had dried on the paper during its long transatlantic journey. His hands trembled as he held those delicate pages, the only tangible link to his former life, and the subtle scent of his wife's perfume still lingered on them, stirring powerful memories of peaceful mornings in Milan before the war plunged the world into chaos. Marco Benedetti received weekly letters from his mother and fiancé, each decorated with small drawings of flowers and hearts, symbols of love that transcended oceans and political conflict. The texture of Italian paper differed from the American kind, rougher, more handmade, constantly reminding him of the subtle cultural differences that made his homeland unique and precious. The news that arrived through these family letters painted a complex picture of the situation in Italy, forcing the prisoners to reevaluate their perceptions of patriotism, loyalty, and historical justice. Salvatore Russo learned through a letter from his sister that many Italian cities were being bombed by both Germans and Allies, turning innocent civilians into victims of a war that no longer made clear sense to anyone involved. Entire families had been separated. Young men continued to die in battles whose military objectives remained nebulous, and civilians suffered severe rationing, while political leaders made decisions from distant palaces. Giuseppe Torriani read with mounting horror about summary executions of Italian soldiers by German troops, brutal punishments inflicted on former allies now deemed traitors after Italy's surrender. His family's letters described an Italy divided, confused, and bleeding, where daily survival had become more important than grand ideologies or nationalist promises. Marco Benedetti wept when he learned that his home village had been occupied by German troops, who treated Italians as suspected collaborators, imposing curfews and confiscating food with systematic brutality. The contrast between the respectful treatment he received from the Americans and the oppression his family suffered at the hands of former German allies created a bitter historical irony that shattered all his notions of military alliances and national identity. One particularly hot August afternoon, Giuseppe Torriani received a letter that would permanently transform his perspective on the war and on his own role in the events of history. His wife Maria wrote about a chance encounter with the widow of an American soldier killed in the Italian campaign, a young woman named Dorothy who had lost her husband in the same battle where Torriani had been captured. The 2 women, one Italian and the other American, had met in a church in Milan where Dorothy prayed for her dead husband while visiting European war graves. Maria described how they spoke at length about loss, love, and the futility of conflicts that tore families apart and destroyed young lives needlessly. Dorothy showed photographs of her late husband, a 23-year-old from Kansas, who had dreamed of becoming a teacher after the war, and Maria shared portraits of Giuseppe in his military uniform. Both women agreed that their men would likely never have hated each other had they met under peaceful circumstances, for they were merely human instruments of political decisions made by leaders who had never taken up arms themselves. The letter ended with Maria transcribing Dorothy's words, "I do not hate your husband, even though he fought against my country. I hate this war that stole so many good men from all sides." Giuseppe read those words over and over, feeling them gradually dissolve years of military propaganda and blind nationalism that had shaped his worldview. The psychological impact of these family letters intensified when the prisoners began sharing excerpts during evening conversations in the barracks. Marco Benedetti read aloud a letter from his fiancée, describing how American soldiers had liberated her town from German occupation, treating Italian civilians kindly, and distributing food rations to starving children. The same kindness they experienced in the Texas camp was being shown by other American soldiers in Italy itself, suggesting that this humanitarian treatment was not a local exception, but a reflection of broader cultural values. Salvatore Russo shared a letter from his older brother, a veteran of the First World War, who wrote, "This war has taught us that the enemies of today can be the friends of tomorrow, if we learn to see men instead of uniforms." Those words resonated deeply with the prisoners, for they captured the internal transformations all were experiencing through their daily coexistence with American captors, who consistently demonstrated humanity. The evening discussions became sessions of collective therapy, where hardened men of war allowed themselves emotional vulnerability, questioning decades of military conditioning that had prepared them to hate abstract enemies. The sound of pages turning as they read letters aloud created an intimate soundtrack that connected that Texas barrack to distant homes in Italy. The worn texture of the letters, reread obsessively, showed how those papers had become treasures more valuable than any material wealth. The correspondence with their families also revealed surprising aspects of Italian perceptions of American soldiers, insights that sharply contrasted with the wartime propaganda they had absorbed during military training. Giuseppe Torriani discovered that his wife volunteered in a hospital that treated wounded soldiers of all nationalities, including Americans captured during battles in Italy. Maria described how these American prisoners were frightened young men who spoke of families, dreams, and fears, just like any wounded Italian soldier. She had spoken with an American bomber pilot who wept as he remembered a girlfriend in Iowa, and with a Marine who showed photographs of his family farm in Missouri. These men showed no hatred for Italians, only war weariness and a desperate desire to return home safely. Marco Benedetti received a letter from a cousin who had deserted the Italian army and joined the partisans fighting alongside American troops against the German occupation. The cousin described American soldiers sharing rations with Italian guerrillas, teaching modern military techniques, and treating former enemies as respected allies in the fight against fascism. Salvatore Russo read a letter from a neighbor who worked as an interpreter for the American army in Italy, reporting how American officers made efforts to minimize damage to civilian property and protect local populations from German reprisals. These revelations formed a mosaic of evidence showing that the American humanity they experienced in the Texas camp was an authentic expression of deep cultural values, not a temporary military tactic or an elaborate theatrical deception. The regular arrival of family letters gradually transformed the prisoner of war camp into a temporary international community where national borders dissolved before the universal human, experiences shared across oceans and continents. War separates bodies, but letters prove that hearts remain, connected by invisible threads stronger than any man-made border. December 1943 brought to the Texas camp an atmospheric transformation that none of the Italian prisoners had anticipated. Even in their most optimistic visions of military captivity, the first Christmas decorations appeared discreetly in the American administrative offices, small ornaments that at first seemed like simple expressions of seasonal nostalgia by guards longing for their faraway families. But when Giuseppe Torriani saw American soldiers installing a genuine Christmas tree in the camp's central square, decorated with colored lights powered by the camp's generators, he realized that something extraordinary was being prepared. The tree was not merely an American religious symbol. It was a declaration that the Italian prisoners would be included in the celebrations, treated as human beings worthy of spiritual dignity during the most sacred season of the Christian calendar. Marco Benedetti watched the preparations with tears in his eyes, for those twinkling lights awakened precious memories of family Christmases in Naples, when his mother prepared elaborate festivities that brought relatives from across the region together. The scent of fresh pine contrasted with the dry air of the Texas desert, creating a nostalgic fragrance that mentally transported the prisoners to European forests blanketed in snow. Salvatore Russo, a pragmatic man hardened by decades of military experience, found himself emotionally vulnerable before those Christmas preparations, for they represented recognition that even captured enemies retained the right to religious celebration and a spiritual connection to their ancestral traditions. The American camp administration organized a Christmas event that completely transcended the prisoners' expectations of humanitarian treatment in a military context. A Catholic Mass was celebrated in the camp's improvised chapel, conducted by an American military chaplain who spoke fluent Italian, having studied in a Roman seminary before the war. The priest offered communion to the Italian prisoners with reverent solemnity, treating them as fellow Christians rather than defeated enemies, demonstrating that certain spiritual truths could transcend temporary political conflicts. Giuseppe Torriani knelt at the improvised altar beside American soldiers, sharing the same sacrament in a moment of religious unity that briefly dissolved all the national and military divisions that officially separated them. The sound of liturgical music filled the adapted hall, creating a sacred atmosphere that connected that isolated place in Texas with ancient European cathedrals and small churches scattered across America. Marco Benedetti sang Christmas hymns in Italian, while the American choir responded in English, creating a multilingual harmony that symbolized the possibility of future peace between nations still at war. The cool texture of the rosary beads in his trembling hands transported him back to the church of his home village, where he had last prayed before being drafted. Salvatore Russo, who had lost his faith during the horrors of the African campaign, found himself whispering prayers long forgotten, reconnecting with spiritual traditions he thought he had abandoned forever. The Christmas banquet organized by the American administration marked another milestone in the prisoners' journey of humanization during captivity. The mess hall tables were decorated with white cloths, lit candles, and floral arrangements that created a festive atmosphere worthy of a family celebration rather than an institutional military meal. The menu included traditional American dishes adapted to Italian tastes, as well as specialties prepared by the prisoners themselves, using ingredients generously supplied by the camp administration. Giuseppe Torriani supervised the preparation of authentic pasta, using recipes passed down through generations of his Milanese family, teaching culinary techniques to American cooks eager to learn about Italian gastronomic traditions. The aroma of garlic, basil, and fresh tomato filled the barracks, stirring powerful olfactory memories that mentally transported everyone present to family kitchens in Italy, where mothers and wives prepared meals with unconditional love. Marco Benedetti contributed traditional Neapolitan desserts, including an improvised version of struffoli that made American soldiers sigh with delight as they tasted sweets they had never encountered before. Salvatore Russo worked with American electricians to create special lighting for the banquet, installing colorful lights that transformed the utilitarian mess hall into a festival space worthy of a luxury hotel. The creamy texture of the traditional sweets melted on their tongues, creating sensory bridges between cultures separated by oceans and war. During the Christmas banquet, a moment of extraordinary humanity crystallized the deep transformations taking place in the hearts of prisoners and captors alike. The American camp commander, Colonel James Morrison, rose to give a toast that would remain etched in the memory of all present for the rest of their lives. Speaking in English with simultaneous translation into Italian, Morrison declared, "On this holy night, I do not see American soldiers and Italian prisoners. I see Christian men sharing the Lord's table, united by a faith that transcends earthly flags." His words were met with an emotional silence, followed by spontaneous applause that echoed through the mess hall like a thunderclap of approval. Giuseppe Torriani stood and replied in Italian, "Colonel Morrison, your men have taught us that enemies can discover brotherhood when they recognize the humanity in each other." Marco Benedetti translated the words into English, allowing the American soldiers to understand the prisoners' profound gratitude for treatment that surpassed any reasonable expectation of military hospitality. Salvatore Russo, a cynical veteran transformed by the experience, added, "If all military leaders treated enemies as brothers temporarily separated, perhaps wars would last weeks instead of years." The sound of glasses clinking in multilingual toasts created a symphony of hope, suggesting the possibility of future peace built on foundations of mutual respect and the recognition of universal human dignity. The Christmas celebration continued with musical performances that solidified the emotional connections between cultures, theoretically at war. The American military band performed special arrangements of Italian Christmas songs, while prisoners sang harmonies that turned the mess hall into an improvised cathedral. Marco Benedetti sang with a clear emotional voice, Tu scendi dalle stelle, the classic Neapolitan Christmas carol, while American soldiers accompanied on instruments, creating a musical fusion that symbolized spiritual unity, transcending political divisions. Giuseppe Torriani led an impromptu prisoners' choir in a rendition of Astro del Ciel, Silent Night in Italian, with American soldiers responding in the verses in English, establishing a musical dialogue that demonstrated how certain universal truths can be expressed in any language. The male voices echoed across the silent camp, reaching guards in the watchtowers who paused their rounds to listen to this symphony of human reconciliation. Overcome with emotion, Salvatore Russo whispered to a fellow prisoner, "If our mothers could see us now, singing with the Americans, they would understand that this war never made sense from the beginning." The emotional texture of that moment would remain etched in the collective memory as proof that genuine humanity could flourish even in the most improbable circumstances. The final sound of united voices in silent prayer created a moment of spiritual transcendence that permanently transformed everyone's perception of the possibilities for peace and brotherhood among nations. That Christmas night of 1943 in the heart of Texas would become a shared legend among former Italian prisoners and American veterans for decades to come, a living testimony that certain human experiences transcend completely the historical circumstances that give rise to them. On that holy night, we discovered that Christmas knows no borders, and that the love of Christ transforms enemies into brothers around the same blessed table. The spring of 1944 brought growing rumors to the Texas camp about peace negotiations and the possible release of the Italian prisoners. News that should have sparked euphoria but instead stirred complex, contradictory feelings in the hearts of men who had learned to find dignity in captivity. Giuseppe Torriani watched the first green shoots sprouting in the gardens he had tended through months of dedicated work, realizing that these plants represented more than agriculture. They symbolized the emotional roots he had developed in this foreign land through labor that was respected and acknowledged. The prospect of returning to Italy meant reunion with his beloved family, but also separation from an unlikely international community that had redefined his ideas about humanity and universal brotherhood. Marco Benedetti continued his carpentry work with undiminished dedication, but his hands trembled slightly as he carved the wood, knowing that each finished piece might be the last he would create in the place where he had discovered that enemies could become respectful mentors of his artisanal skills. Salvatore Russo inspected the camp's electrical installations with obsessive precision, as if he wanted to leave a lasting legacy of Italian technical competence for the Americans who had treated him as a valued professional rather than a defeated slave. The familiar feel of the tools in his hands awakened an anticipatory nostalgia for a future where he might never again experience that unique blend of productive purpose and professional recognition he had found in captivity. The aroma of the Texas spring, a mix of wildflowers and sun-warmed earth, infused his memories with a fragrance he would forever associate with a period of deep personal discovery and transformation. Nightly discussions in the barracks took on a melancholy, philosophical tone, as the prisoners slowly processed the implications of their eventual freedom and returned to the outside world. Giuseppe Torriani admitted to his companions that he feared being unable to adequately explain to his family the inner transformations he had experienced in captivity. For how could he describe to those who had never left Italy that Americans had shown consistent kindness and genuine respect to captured enemies? Marco Benedetti confessed that he often dreamed of future conversations with his fiancée, imagining how she would react when she learned he had picked up basic English while chatting with American soldiers during work breaks, forging improbable friendships with men whom his country's propaganda had painted as uncultured barbarians. Ever pragmatic, Salvatore Russo wondered whether it would be possible to preserve, in post-war Italy, the insights into human nature he had gained through daily coexistence with captors who treated work as respectful collaboration rather than forced exploitation. Their conversations revealed a deep anxiety about readjusting to societies that might not understand or value the lessons of universal humanity they had learned in such unusual circumstances. The sound of pages turning as they reread family letters for the 100th time created a nostalgic soundtrack that connected them simultaneously to a lost past and an uncertain future. The worn texture of the photographs they carried in their pockets showed how these objects had become talismans against the fear of forgetting beloved faces during months of separation. In May 1944, the official announcement of imminent release provoked unexpectedly nuanced reactions among the Italian prisoners, who discovered that the long-desired freedom came with unforeseen losses and painful farewells. Giuseppe Torriani organized a ceremony of gratitude where prisoners presented the American soldiers with handcrafted gifts as tokens of appreciation for treatment that had exceeded every reasonable expectation of military hospitality. His hands trembled as he handed Colonel Morrison a small hand-carved crucifix, a religious symbol representing a renewed faith in the human goodness he had discovered through the experience of humane captivity. Marco Benedetti presented the carpentry supervisors with miniature furniture he had fashioned during sleepless nights, pieces that displayed traditional Neapolitan craftsmanship, passed down through generations of skilled artisans. Salvatore Russo installed a special electrical system in the administrative office as a parting gift, a voluntary project symbolizing his gratitude for the chance to exercise respected technical skills during a period that could easily have been marked only by systematic humiliation. The American soldiers accepted these gifts with visible emotion, many admitting that the experience of supervising Italian prisoners had permanently changed their own views of war, nationality, and the possibility of fraternity among peoples once considered enemies. The scent of freshly cut flowers decorating the ceremony mingled with the discreet tears shed by men long accustomed to hiding emotional vulnerability. The rough texture of the handkerchiefs used to wipe damp eyes contrasted with the softness of the feelings that flowed freely in that farewell moment of historic significance. The final liberation ceremony transcended all conventional military protocols, becoming a celebration of rediscovered humanity and improbable friendships forged in the most unexpected circumstances. Colonel Morrison spoke with heartfelt emotion. "You arrived here as prisoners of war, but you leave as ambassadors of the possibility of peace between nations that have learned to see men where once they saw only enemies." Giuseppe Torriani replied on behalf of all the prisoners. "Colonel, your men have taught us that the true victory in war is not in defeating enemies, but in discovering brothers disguised as adversaries," Marco Benedetti added, in hesitant but sincere English. "We go home different men, carrying American friendship in Italian hearts." Salvatore Russo, the once cynical veteran transformed by the experience, concluded, "This war separated us geographically, but this camp united us spiritually in a way no political peace will ever undo." The American soldiers formed an honor guard as the former prisoners marched toward the trains that would return them to civilian life. But the procession had the atmosphere of a celebration rather than a routine military procedure. The sound of spontaneous applause echoed across the camp as men of different nationalities said their goodbyes with prolonged handshakes and embraces that transcended all linguistic and cultural barriers. The final texture of the American hands they clasped for the last time would remain, etched in the Italians' tactile memory as physical proof that certain human experiences create connections more enduring than political treaties or official military alliances. On the trains carrying them back to the Atlantic coast for embarkation to Italy, the former prisoners silently processed the long-term implications of their transformative experience in the heart of Texas. Giuseppe Torriani composed mental letters to his wife, searching for words to describe how enemy soldiers had shown a Christian kindness that many of his own Italian countrymen had never shown one another during decades of civilian life. Marco Benedetti watched the American landscape pass by the train window, imprinting in his visual memory the details of a country he would forever associate with the discovery that national prejudices were artificial constructions that crumbled in the presence of authentic human connection. Salvatore Russo mentally calculated how many years it would take to rebuild war-torn Italy, wondering if it would be possible to apply on European soil the lessons of respectful cooperation and dignified work he had learned from his American captors. All carried a deep certainty that they were returning to Italy as fundamentally different men, bearers of insights into human nature that transcended entirely the military, circumstances that had led them to that unique experience. The rhythmic sound of the train wheels on the tracks created a hypnotic beat that gradually carried them from their transformative present toward a future where they would have to integrate the lessons learned in captivity with the complex realities of national reconstruction. The texture of the train tickets in their pockets symbolized a passage not only across geography, but also across spirit, of men who had discovered that enemies could become teachers of humanity in the most improbable of circumstances. Years later, when American veterans and former Italian prisoners reunited at international gatherings, all would agree that those months in the Texas camp had been more transformative than decades of life in peacetime. True freedom did not come when we left the camp, but when we discovered that human hearts know neither borders nor permanent enmities. Decades later, when the Second World War had become a chapter recorded in history books, Giuseppe Torriani, Marco Benedetti, and Salvatore Russo maintained regular correspondence with the American veterans who had served in that Texas camp. Their families grew up hearing stories of how enemies had become friends through music, respected work, and shared religious celebrations. The children of those former prisoners would one day visit America as tourists, carrying the addresses of the American families their fathers had met under such extraordinary circumstances. And at family gatherings, both in Italy and the United States, the younger generations would learn that certain human experiences completely transcend the political divisions that seem to define historical eras, proving that genuine humanity can flourish in the most unlikely contexts, forever transforming those privileged enough to witness it.